A warning to all listeners that this podcast will discuss residential and day schools and contain sensitive and distressing information. For those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the following information, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. And a 24-hour National Residential School Crisis Line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Segal, Ani Bojo, hello everyone, and welcome to this episode. I'm Hannah, a Ganyakahaga woman working as a summer student for the United Church of Canada's Canadian Shield Regional Council's Right Relations team. So far in this podcast series, we've talked about the history of residential and day schools, some misconceptions surrounding the schools, and the apologies offered by the institutions responsible for the schools. In this episode, I want to draw attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings, their calls to action, and how the United Church is responding to these calls. Just a reminder that I have already released 3 full-length episodes over the past few weeks. If you haven't had the opportunity to, I suggest you go back and take a listen to these episodes as they provide some context for the next few parts of this series. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created in 2008. It was created due to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, and part of their responsibilities with relation to residential schools were to establish a national research center, collect documents from churches and governments, gather first-hand accounts from survivors, and ultimately issue a final report. This report was delivered in 2015 and is, in my opinion, probably the most comprehensive document discussing the history and effects of residential schools around the country. The report shed light on the abuse that occurred at the institutions, much of which I've already covered in the other podcast episodes, and also brought forward a staggering fact that according to their research and review of the documentation, a confirmed at least 3,213 children died. It's important to remember that this number is based on the documents the TRC were able to review. Many archives have gone missing, were destroyed, or were not kept well. So in reality, this number is most likely much higher. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website highlights a very important report from Dr. Scott Hamilton entitled "Where Are the Children Buried?" The report covers what the title suggests, what happened to the children that died while at residential school. Hamilton found that the majority of the children had been buried either at the school or at neighboring burial yards. However, there were some exceptions to this. For instance, at Red Deer, a body of a male student was returned home because the staff and students at the school were too sick from influenza to bury him in their cemetery. Another case showed that at File Hills, the body of a male student was sent to the Pipikissis Reserve, despite the fact that his parents lived on the Carlisle Reserve. It's important to point out that many families did not know about their children's deaths. Some just never returned home after school. Families that did know about their child's death would often request the return of their body for burial on their home reserve, and so they could arrange for their own ceremonies. But the majority of these requests were turned down, most of the time due to cost of transportation. In many cases, there is not much information on the whereabouts of the burial grounds at the school, and there are no markers, so the graves are difficult to find. At File Hills, for instance, the records only referenced a location within a specific quarter section of the land. The graves were only found due to local knowledge and satellite imagery. At other schools, graves are able to be found due to ground-penetrating radar. Over the past couple years, there have been a number of movements led by Indigenous communities to find the graves of the children who died at residential school and to repatriate the remains back to their home communities. I'm sure you remember the May 2021 findings at Kamloops Indian Residential School, which shocked many non-Indigenous people and was all too familiar for Indigenous communities. I urge you to pay attention to another project being led by Sishat First Nation, which is investigating the number of deaths and the location of grave sites at Albany Indian Residential School, which was one of the United Church-run institutes. Earlier this year, in February, they revealed that their research confirmed that 67 children had died while attending the school. They had also used ground-penetrating radar, which suggested there are 17 geophysical features in their surveyed area. At the time of their report, they had only investigated a little more than 10% of the 100 hectares they will be surveying. This is an incredibly important project that we should all have eyes on. Along with the TRC's 2015 report, they also published a list of calls to action, which provided 94 recommendations for Canadian colonial institutions to take on their way towards reconciliation. 12 of these calls were directed toward religious institutions that played a role in colonization and the residential school system. I want to revisit some of these recommendations that are in the process of being answered. Call number 46. We call upon the parties to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement to develop and sign a covenant of reconciliation that would identify principles for working collaboratively to advance reconciliation in Canadian society. The parties involved in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement have been working on the covenant since 2020. It was delayed due to the pandemic. The covenant has not yet been delivered. According to the Right Reverend Carmen Lansdowne, the United Church is a very active participant in the discussion, and timing on when it comes before General Council depends on other parties involved in the discussion, and not all parties are in the same place yet. Call number 59. We call upon church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why apologies to former residential school students, their families, and communities were necessary. The United Church has created staff roles that are reconciliation animators at the national level, plus there are reconciliation committees in many congregations. Inclusion of Indigenous pathways in the new 2022 to 2025 strategic plan will be not so much on education, but more Indigenous ways of considering and implementing the Church's work. The United Church is also engaged in a task group on spiritual violence, and that work is forthcoming. There are also materials and worship resources on the United Church website, including a website that discusses the history of schools and includes photos at thechildrenremembered.ca. There are also right relations teams, such as the one I work for with the Canadian Shield Regional Council, that have developed a number of resources. I would encourage individual churches to engage with these, as congregations have the duty to engage with these resources as well. Call number 60. We call upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faiths, in collaboration with Indigenous spiritual leaders, survivors, schools of theology, seminaries, and other religious training centers, to develop and teach curriculum for all student clergy and all clergy and staff who work in Aboriginal communities on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, the history and legacy of residential schools and the roles of the church parties in that system, the history and legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities, and the responsibility that churches have to mitigate such conflicts and prevent spiritual violence. This education is now offered, if not required, by all United Church affiliated programs and Con Ed options available. There is significant ecumenical work on the topic of spiritual violence committed by churches among Indigenous peoples, including the development of study materials. Call number 73. We call upon the federal government to work with churches, Aboriginal communities, and former residential school students to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries, including, where possible, plot maps showing the location of deceased residential school children. The United Church has been compliant with national and regional archive staff seeking the church's information on deaths, burials, and cemeteries. There is not yet an online registry, however, it is currently in development. Call number 74. We call upon the federal government to work with the churches and Aboriginal community leaders to inform the families of children who died at residential schools of the child's burial location, and to respond to families' wishes for appropriate commemoration ceremonies and markers, and reburial in home communities where requested. The United Church of Canada has started contacting families of children who died at 4 of the schools run by the United Church: Red Deer, File Hills, Regina, and Brandon. However, further work is needed to determine more names of those who are buried at the schools. The United Church is committed to work with Indigenous communities and the government in any other initiatives. Call number 75. We call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, churches, Aboriginal communities, former residential school students, and current landowners to develop and implement strategies and procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or other sites at which residential school children were buried. This is to include the provision of appropriate memorial ceremonies and commemorative markers to honor the deceased children. The United Church has supported work to identify, reclaim, preserve, and document cemeteries and honor student burials. This has happened at the following former residential schools: Red Deer, Edmonton, File Hills, Regina, and Brandon. They are committed to working on other sites. Call number 81. We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with survivors and their organizations and other parties to the settlement agreement, to commission and install a publicly accessible, highly visible residential schools national monument in the city of Ottawa to honor survivors and all the children who were lost to their families and communities. The United Church supports and is willing to contribute to this monument. They sent a letter of support for the monument and earlier this year participated in the public announcement of the site in Ottawa. Call number 82. We call upon the provincial and territorial governments, in collaboration with survivors and their organizations and other parties to the settlement agreement, to commission and install a publicly accessible, highly visible residential schools monument in each capital city to honor survivors and all of the children who were lost to their families and communities. Winnipeg has a monument in place. Toronto and Edmonton are currently in progress, and there are plans to build a residential school monument in Regina. The United Church is willing to collaborate in any initiatives taken by the provinces and territories. As you can see then, there is still a lot of work to be done to fully live up to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. However, in my opinion, this is a good start. I would also like to draw attention to two other initiatives that the United Church has undergone as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Along with the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, under which they paid $6.45 million, the Healing Fund was also created, which provides communities with up to $15,000 to create healing, culture, and/or language projects. As well, the United Church is currently in the process of creating a fully autonomous Indigenous church. In 2022, two proposals were approved, one of which would remove structural barriers toward developing and sustaining an autonomous Indigenous church, and another that authorizes approval of a new structure of the Indigenous church within the United Church. We're going to be touching a bit on this in a future episode. However, I want to remind all regional councils that the remit is in the process of a vote right now, and every council needs to vote. If you fail to fill out the remit, your vote will be counted as a no and could cause this remit to be denied. You have until March 2024 to get your vote in, and results will be reported at the annual meeting in October 2024. So make sure to discuss it with your councils, cast your vote, and commit yourself to supporting UNDRIP and the TRC's calls to action. Thank you for tuning into this episode and the rest of the podcast. Taking these steps to educate yourself on the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples at the hands of Canadian colonial institutions is vital in the journey towards reconciliation, which we will be discussing in next week's episode. Once more, for those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the information in this podcast, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. And a 24-hour National Residential School Crisis Line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Nyawa Chimigwech. Thank you for listening.